If there's one thing I can't stand, it's a graduation ceremony. It's full of phonies wearing square hats, pretending they're going to change the world while their parents clap like trained seals. It's depressing as hell. I'm Reagan Harvey, and the only thing I saw that day was two empty chairs. My folks skipped the whole lousy show to go enable my brother, a guy who was about as genuine as a plastic plant. Now they want to pay me to help him destroy his wife. It really kills me. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The rain was turning the city gray when they finally walked into my office. The rain in St. Jude's Crossing doesn't wash anything away. It just makes the grime stick harder to the pavement. It was raining the day I graduated, a relentless gray drizzle that turned the world into a blurred photograph. And it is raining now, 3 years later, as I stare out the window of my second-floor office. The rhythm of the drops against the glass acts like a metronome, ticking away the seconds of a life spent watching, waiting, and documenting the failures of others. In this line of work, you learn quickly that silence tells you more than noise ever could, and absence is often the loudest presence in the room. I learned that lesson not in a classroom or a stakeout van, but in a folding metal chair on the stage of the university auditorium, holding a diploma that felt less like an achievement and more like a receipt for a debt I had paid entirely on my own. I remember the humidity of that auditorium, the smell of floor wax and cheap perfume, and the collective hum of pride radiating from the families packed into the bleachers. I sat in the third row wearing a gown that I had rented with the last $20 in my bank account. The dean was droning on about justice, about the sanctity of the law and the weight of the badge. But my eyes were fixed on two specific spots in the audience, row G seats 12 and 13. I had reserved them months in advance. I had mailed the tickets with a handwritten note. I had called the night before to confirm the time. But as the names were called one by one, and students rose to wave at cheering parents and weeping grandparents, seats 12 and 13 remained stubbornly, aggressively empty. They looked like missing teeth in a perfect smile. It wasn't a traffic jam. It wasn't a flat tire. I knew where my parents, Robert and Ellen Harvey, were. I knew because my brother, Kyle, had called me 2 hours before the ceremony. He hadn't called to wish me luck. He had called because he was parked outside his ex-girlfriend's apartment complex, 3 towns over, convinced she was seeing someone else. And he needed support. He needed someone to talk him down, or more accurately, he needed Mom and Dad to come sit with him to hold his hand, to validate his paranoia, and to eventually pay the retainer for the lawyer when the police inevitably showed up, to ask why he was loitering on private property. They chose him. They always chose him. It wasn't a decision made out of malice, I don't think. It was a reflex. Kyle was the crisis that needed managing. I was the steady hum of competence that could be ignored. That day on the stage, I didn't feel rage. Rage burns hot and fast. What I felt was a cold calcification in my chest, a shutter closing over a lens. I took my diploma, walked across the stage to polite applause from strangers, and decided that I was done seeking their approval. I would trade approval for truth. The memory fades as the sound of a heavy car door slamming brings me back to the present. I turn away from the window and survey my domain. My office isn't much a single room above a dry cleaner on 4th Street, smelling faintly of steam and old paper. But it is mine. The frosted glass on the door reads, Reagan Harvey Private Investigations. The ink on my license is barely dry, yet the cynicism feels vintage. I specialize in infidelity, corporate theft, and insurance fraud, but mostly, I specialize in patience. I sit down behind my desk, a heavy oak piece I salvaged from a closing law firm, and wait. I know they are coming. They called 20 minutes ago, their voices tight with that familiar frantic energy that only surrounds one topic. The knock on the door is hesitant, almost polite, which is a stark contrast to the way they usually barge into my life. Come in, I say, my voice steady. The door opens and Robert and Ellen Harvey step into the room. They look older than I remember, though it has only been 6 months since I last saw them at Christmas. My father is wearing his Sunday suit, the gray one with the slightly frayed lapel, and my mother is clutching her purse like it contains state secrets. They look out of place in my dim, dusty office, like 2 porcelain figurines set down in a mechanic's garage. They don't congratulate me on the office. They don't ask about the license I spent 2 years earning while working double shifts at a diner. They don't mention the graduation. They sit in the two client chairs opposite my desk, the wood creaking under the weight of their expectations. Reagan, my father starts clearing his throat. He looks at the framed degree on the wall, then quickly away, as if it hurts his eyes. We need your help. It's a professional matter. I charge $50 an hour plus expenses, I say flatly. I don't offer them coffee. This is business. If they want to be family, they can invite me to dinner, but they haven't done that in years. It's Kyle, my mother blurts out, unable to hold it in. Of course it is. It is always Kyle. He's going through a terrible time, Reagan. Just terrible. Sarah, that woman is destroying him. I lean back, steepling my fingers. Kyle and Sarah have been married for 5 years. Sarah is a librarian, quiet, mousy, the kind of woman who remembers birthdays and brings casseroles to sick neighbors. Kyle is a pharmaceutical sales rep who spends more money on golf clubs than he does on his mortgage. They're divorcing, I ask. She filed. My father says, his jaw tightening. Can you believe the nerve after everything we've done for them? The down payment on the house, the car. She filed for divorce and she's demanding alimony. She wants half the assets. She wants to bleed him dry. And let me guess, I say, already knowing the script. Kyle says it's not his fault. It's not, my mother insists, leaning forward. Her eyes are wide, desperate to believe the narrative. Kyle says she's seeing someone. He says she's been sneaking around for months. Late nights, unexplained mileage on the car, money missing from the joint account. He says she's cheating Reagan. And in this state, if we can prove infidelity, she gets nothing. No alimony, no claim on his pension, nothing. I look at them, really look at them. They are terrified. Not for Sarah, the woman they welcomed into the family, but for their golden boy's wallet. They are so desperate to protect him that they are willing to destroy her. Kyle has spun a story, a victim narrative where he is the martyr, and his quiet wife is the villain. And they have swallowed it whole because the alternative that their son is flawed is too painful to accept. Kyle wants to hire a PI, I ask. He can't afford the big firms right now, my father admits, looking at his hands. His assets are frozen because of the filing, and, well, we thought, since you're doing this now, your family, you'd be discreet. You'd look out for his interests. You want me to tail Sarah, I clarify. You want me to catch her in the act. We want you to get the proof, my father says, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulls out a checkbook. The sight of it is almost comical. They wouldn't pay for my textbooks, they wouldn't pay for my cap and gown, but for Kyle's revenge, the checkbook comes out before the code is even off. We'll pay your rate. We're not asking for a favor. We're hiring a professional. He writes the check. The scratching of the pen is loud in the quiet office. He tears it out and slides it across the desk. It's for $2,000, a retainer. It sits there on the dark wood, a rectangle of pale blue paper that represents so much more than money. It represents their priorities. They are willing to invest in my skills only when those skills serve the brother who sucked the oxygen out of my childhood. I look at the check then, at my parents. They're waiting for me to nod, to agree to join the conspiracy. They expect me to be the loyal little sister, eager to please, eager to be included, even if it's just as the hired help. They think they're buying my loyalty. They think this money brings me back into the fold. But they are wrong. I think of Sarah. I think of the times I've seen her at family gatherings, sitting quietly in the corner while Kyle held court, boasting about sales numbers that were likely inflated. I think of the way she flinched when he raised his voice. I think of the empty chairs at my graduation, and the reason they were empty because Kyle needed to control a woman who was trying to leave him. Now, history is repeating itself. He is trying to control Sarah to punish her for leaving, and he is using our parents as the weapon. I'll take the case, I say, picking up the check. My voice is cool, professional. I don't smile. Good, my father breathes out relieved. We knew we could count on you, Reagan. Kyle says she goes out every Tuesday and Thursday night. Starts there. Get us the photos. Get us the dirt. We need to nail her to the wall in court next month. I'll find out exactly what she's doing. I promise. And I mean it. I will find the truth. They assume the truth will exonerate Kyle and damn Sarah. They assume that because I am their daughter, I will look at the world through the same distorted lens they do. But I am a private investigator now. My allegiance is to the evidence. My allegiance is to the reality that exists outside of their delusions. Thank you, honey, my mother says, standing up. She looks lighter, as if by paying me, she has absolved herself of the worry. We knew you'd help your brother. I'm doing my job. I correct her. They leave the way they came, focused on the mission, blind to the person they just hired. The door clicks shut and the silence rushes back in heavy and damp. I look down at the check again. I will cash it. I will use their money to fuel my car and buy my film. I will use their money to uncover the secrets they are so desperate to find, and perhaps the ones they are desperate to hide. I open my desk drawer and pull out my camera, a heavy DSLR with a long-range lens. I check the battery. I check the memory card. I walk to the window and watch them get into their car below. The rain is falling harder now, turning the street into a river of oil and reflection. They drive away, heading back to their warm house and their comfortable lies. I turn back to the empty room. I have work to do. The client wants proof of who Sarah really is. I'm going to give it to them. I'm going to give them everything they paid for, and God help them when they get it. The shutter mechanism in my mind clicks once, a sharp, definitive sound. The investigation has begun. Investigation is 90% boredom and 10% adrenaline, but the boredom is heavy, sticking to you like the damp upholstery of a stakeout car. Tuesday night arrived with a fresh layer of fog rolling off the river, obscuring the streetlights of St. Jude's Crossing, until they looked like bruised peaches suspended in the dark. I was parked 3 houses down from Kyle and Sarah's, colonial slouching low in the driver's seat of my unremarkable gray sedan, a thermos of black coffee cooling in the cup holder. My camera, a high-end DSLR with a telephoto lens capable of reading a text message from 100 yards away, sat on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. Kyle had been specific about the schedule. Sarah left the house at 6:30 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday, returning past 10. He claimed she was meeting a lover. He claimed she was spending his money on hotel rooms and expensive dinners. As the garage door rumbled open, I checked my ISO settings, preparing for low light. Sarah's car, a sensible 5-year-old compact that had seen better days, backed out slowly. She didn't look like a woman rushing to a tryst. She looked like a woman escaping a burning building. Her shoulders hunched, her hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled tension. I gave her a 2-block lead before pulling out. Tailing someone is an art form. You have to be close enough to see the turn signals, but far enough back to be just another pair of headlights in the rearview mirror. I expected her to head toward the highway, toward the flashy casinos on the outskirts of town or the motel strip on Route 9. Instead, she turned south, driving deeper into the city, past the manicured lawns of the suburbs and into the cracked pavement of the hollows. This was the part of town the city council forgot, where the streetlights were broken and the buildings wore their neglect like scars. My cynicism spiked. A lover in a bad neighborhood usually meant drugs or something equally sordid. I felt a pang of disappointment. I wanted Sarah to be the victim, but in my line of work, you learn that everyone has a secret, and usually it's an ugly one. She pulled into a gravel lot beside a brick building that had once been a textile factory. A faded sign hung over the metal door, St. Jude's Community Outreach, Seniors in Need. I killed my engine and watched. Sarah didn't check her makeup in the mirror. She didn't spray perfume. She grabbed a canvas tote bag from the back seat and hurried to the door, punching in a code. I waited 5 minutes, then grabbed my camera and slipped out of the car. The rain had turned to a fine mist that clung to my eyelashes. I moved through the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the few working security lamps, until I found a ground floor window with the blinds slightly askew. I raised the camera, the heavy lens cool against my palm, and looked through the viewfinder. What I saw made me lower the camera for a moment just to process the disconnect between the accusation and the reality. Sarah wasn't in the arms of another man. She was wearing a plastic apron over her blouse, her hair tied back in a severe bun. She was standing behind a steam table serving ladles of soup to a line of elderly people who looked like the world had left them behind. I raised the camera again. Click. Sarah laughing with a toothless man in an army jacket. Click. Sarah gently guiding a woman with a walker to a table. Click. Sarah in the back kitchen, scrubbing industrial-sized pots with raw red hands, scrubbing away the stress of her life with a steel wool pad. There was no glamour here. There was no infidelity. There was only service. She was spending her evenings washing dishes and feeding the hungry, likely, because it was the only place she felt useful, the only place she was treated with gratitude instead of contempt. I took 50 photos that night documenting every minute of her affair. The narrative my parents had bought the greedy, cheating wife dissolved with every shutter snap, replaced by an image of a woman trying to save her soul through charity. Thursday night was different. Thursday was Kyle's turn. He had told Mom and Dad he was working late, inventory checks at the regional warehouse. I picked him up at the office at 5:00 p.m. sharp. He didn't head to the warehouse. He drove his company-leased luxury sedan straight to the Gilded Lily, the most expensive steakhouse in the district, the kind of place where the valet parking costs more than my hourly rate. I parked across the street, the neon sign of a 24-hour pharmacy reflecting on my hood, and waited. He didn't wait long. A woman arrived 10 minutes later. She was everything. Sarah wasn't loud, flashy, draped in designer labels that screamed, "New money." She slid into the booth opposite him, and the transformation in my brother was instant. The stress he complained about to our parents vanished. He was charming, expansive, ordering wine without looking at the price list. I switched to my longest lens. Through the plate glass window of the restaurant, the scene was perfectly framed like a movie set. Click. Kyle reaching across the table to hold her hand, his wedding ring glinting under the ambient lighting. Click. The waiter, bringing a bottle of champagne Dom Perignon, if the label was right, paid for no doubt with the funds he claimed he didn't have for alimony. Click. Kyle handing her a small velvet box. She opened it to reveal a diamond bracelet. I zoomed in. The clarity was brutal. I could see the delight on her face and the smug satisfaction on his. He wasn't just cheating, he was celebrating it. He was siphoning off the marital assets to fund a fantasy life while his wife scrubbed pots to feel human. The dinner lasted 2 hours. They left the restaurant arm in arm, stumbling slightly drunk on wine and arrogance. I followed them 3 blocks to the Hotel Beaux-Arts, a boutique establishment known for its discretion and its high thread count. They didn't even try to hide it. Kyle handed the valet his keys and walked her right through the front doors, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. I parked in the loading zone, hazard lights on, and ran to the lobby entrance, staying in the shadows of the revolving door. I caught the money-shot Kyle leaning in to kiss her by the elevator bank, the floor indicator dinging softly as the doors slid open to swallow them whole. Click, click, click. The sound of the shutter was a rapid-fire judgment. I had them. I had the timestamps. I had the location. I had the undeniable proof that Kyle Harvey was a liar, a thief, and a fool. I drove back to my office in silence, the radio off. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a simmering cold anger. It wasn't just that he was cheating. People cheat. It was the setup. He had weaponized our parents against Sarah. He had used their love for him and their disappointment in me to fund the investigation that would hang him. It was almost Shakespearean in its hubris. He was so convinced of his own invincibility, so sure that I was just the little sister who would do as she was told, that he hadn't even bothered to be careful. He thought he was the director of this play, but he had forgotten that the cameraman sees everything. Back in the office, the only light came from the dual monitors on my desk. The rain had picked up again, drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. I uploaded the files. On the left monitor, I pulled up the folder labeled Sarah. A grid of images filled the screen. Sarah serving soup. Sarah holding a mop. Sarah listening intently to a veteran's story. The lighting was harsh, fluorescent, unflattering, but the subject was radiant with quiet dignity. On the right monitor, I pulled up Kyle. The contrast was visceral. Candlelight wine silk diamonds, the images oozed sleaze. The timestamps overlapped perfectly. While Sarah was serving others, Kyle was serving himself. I sat there for a long time, the glow of the screens illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had a choice. A good sister, the sister my parents wanted, the one who sought their approval above all else, would delete the folder on the right. She would go to Robert and Ellen and say, "I found nothing on Sarah, but I couldn't track Kyle." She would protect the family myth. She would let Sarah take the fall. Let her be branded a cheater in court. Let her lose the house and the alimony just to keep the peace. That's what they paid for. The check in my bank account was a contract for loyalty, not truth. But then I looked at the photo of Sarah again. I zoomed in on her hands red and chapped from the dishwater. I thought about the graduation ceremony. I thought about the empty chairs. My parents had skipped my achievement to enable Kyle's toxicity. If I buried this evidence, I wouldn't just be a bad investigator. I would be an accomplice. I would be helping them destroy an innocent woman, just so they didn't have to face the reality that their son was a moral vacuum. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a fresh flash drive. I didn't feel conflicted anymore. The noir film in my head had reached its turning point. The detective doesn't get the girl, and he doesn't get the money, but he gets the truth. I dragged both folders, Sarah Charity and Kyle Affair, onto the drive. The progress bar moved slowly, green pixels filling the bar like sand in an hourglass. Copying files. My parents wanted a report. They wanted to know what was happening in the dark. Well, I was going to turn on the floodlights. I wasn't doing this for Kyle, and I wasn't doing it for Mom and Dad. I was doing it for the American value of fair play. You don't get to kick someone when they're down, and you certainly don't get to hire your sister to help you do it. I ejected the drive and slipped it into my pocket. The plastic felt warm. It was the heaviest thing I had ever carried. The planning phase was over. The surveillance was done. Now came the execution. The court date was in 3 days. I wouldn't tell them what I found. I wouldn't give them a chance to spin it or bury it. I would do exactly what a professional does. I would present my findings to the court. The shutter had clicked. The image was captured. Now it was time to develop the picture for the world to see. Family court is a specific kind of purgatory. It smells of cheap floor wax anxiety and the stale coffee of lawyers who bill by the minute. Courtroom 4B was no different, a windowless box of wood and fluorescent light designed to strip the emotion out of the dissolution of a life. I sat in the back row, initially clutching my briefcase, like a shield watching the players take their positions on the stage. On the left, the plaintiff, my brother Kyle. He was wearing a navy suit that cost more than my first car. His hair perfectly coiffed, radiating the smug confidence of a man who has never been told no without his parents stepping in to negotiate the terms. Behind him sat Robert and Ellen, my parents. They looked like the picture of aggrieved nobility glaring across the aisle at the defendant's table, as if sheer disapproval could vaporize the woman sitting there. And there was Sarah. She sat alone. She didn't have a high-priced legal team. She had a court-appointed representative who looked overworked and tired. Sarah's shoulders were slumped, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, resigned to the slaughter. She thought she was about to lose everything. She thought the system was rigged against her, because in her experience with the Harvey family, it always had been. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "All rise." Judge Holloway entered. He was a man cut from granite in his late 60s with a face that looked like a topographical map of hard decisions. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of someone who respected the law more than the people trying to bend it. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and looked down at the docket. "Harvey versus Harvey." He read his voice a deep rumble. "We are here to determine the division of assets and the matter of spousal support. The plaintiff alleges infidelity on the part of the defendant, thereby contesting the alimony claim. Is that correct? It is, Your Honor, Kyle's lawyer said, standing up. He was a slick man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We intend to prove that Mrs. Harvey has been engaging in an extramarital affair, squandering marital assets, and acting in bad faith. Very well, Holloway said. Call your witness. We call Reagan Harvey, private investigator, the lawyer announced. I stood up. The wooden bench creaked beneath me. I could feel my parents' eyes on me beaming with pride. To them, this was my role in the family script, the loyal cleaner, the one who sweeps up the mess, so the golden boy can keep shining. I walked down the aisle, the sound of my heels echoing on the linoleum like the ticking of a clock. I passed Sarah, who didn't look up. She looked shrunken, defeated. I passed Kyle, who gave me a subtle wink, a conspiratorial gesture that made my stomach turn. I took the stand. I placed my hand on the Bible. I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. For the first time in my life, I intended to do exactly that, regardless of who it hurt. Ms. Harvey, the lawyer began pacing in front of the stand. You were hired by the plaintiff's family to investigate the conduct of the defendant, Sarah Harvey, correct? I was hired to investigate the fidelity of the marriage, I corrected calmly. My contract specified surveillance to determine if marital misconduct was occurring. The lawyer waved his hand dismissively. Semantics. And in the course of your surveillance, did you track the defendant's movements on Tuesday and Thursday nights? I did. And did you find her meeting with individuals outside the marriage? I did. Kyle smirks. My mother squeezed my father's hand. They thought the trap had snapped shut. Excellent, the lawyer preened. Please describe for the court what you found. Better yet, you have photographic evidence? I do, I said. I have prepared a digital presentation for the court. I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and handed it to the bailiff, who plugged it into the courtroom's AV system. The projector hummed to life, casting a rectangle of white light onto the blank wall beside the judge's bench. This, I said, my voice steady, is the documentation of Sarah Harvey's activities on the nights in question. Click. The first image appeared. It wasn't a hotel room. It wasn't a bar. It was Sarah Hare in a net spooning stew into a styrofoam bowl for a homeless man. The courtroom went silent. Click. Sarah wiping down a sticky table at the community center. Click. Sarah holding the hand of an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her face soft with compassion. On Tuesday and Thursday nights, I narrated, keeping my tone clinical. The defendant volunteers at St. Jude's Community Outreach. She helps feed approximately 200 seniors and unhoused individuals per week. The individuals she was meeting were people in need. The lawyer froze. His smile faltered. Objection. This is irrelevant. Overruled, Judge Holloway boomed, leaning forward. The witness is answering your question, counselor. She is describing the defendant's activities. Continue, Ms. Harvey. However, I said, raising my voice slightly to cut over the rising murmur from my parents' bench, my investigation into the marriage revealed significant misconduct. I hit the remote. Click. The screen changed. The lighting shifted from the harsh fluorescence of the soup kitchen to the warm, romantic glow of the gilded lily. The image showed Kyle. He was laughing, a glass of wine in his hand. This was taken last Thursday, I said. At the same time, Sarah was washing dishes. Click. Kyle kissing the woman across the table. Her face was clearly visible. It wasn't Sarah. Click. A close-up of the receipt on the table captured with my telephoto lens. A dinner for two totaling $400 paid for with the joint credit card ending in 4590. The silence in the room shattered. Kyle stood up, his face flushing a violent red. What the hell is this? You can't show that. Sit down, Mr. Harvey. The judge barked, slamming his gavel. Sit down or I will hold you in contempt. I didn't look at Kyle. I didn't look at my parents, though I could hear my mother gasping a sound like a balloon losing air. I kept clicking. The shutter sounds in my head synced with the images on the wall. Click. The hotel lobby. Click. The elevator embrace. Click. the diamond bracelet. Purchased, I added, checking my notes, from Miller's Jewelry on the 14th, valued at $3,000. Marital funds. This is a lie, Kyle screamed, losing all composure. She doctored them. She's lying. These photos are time-stamped and geotagged, I said, addressing the judge directly. I have the raw files available for forensic analysis. The investigation commissioned by the plaintiff's parents, Robert and Ellen Harvey, has conclusively proven that the only party engaging in infidelity, financial deception, and marital misconduct is the plaintiff, Kyle Harvey. I shut off the projector. The screen went black, leaving the afterimage of Kyle's betrayal burned into everyone's retinas. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Sarah was staring at me, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of sudden, overwhelming relief. She realized she wasn't alone. Judge Holloway took off his glasses. He cleaned them slowly with a microfiber cloth, the motion deliberate and terrifying. He put them back on and turned his gaze not to Kyle, but to the gallery, to my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Harvey, the judge said, his voice low and dangerous. Please stand. Robert and Ellen stood up trembling. They looked small. They looked like children caught playing with matches. You came into my courtroom, the judge began, supporting a petition to strip your daughter-in-law of her rights. You hired an investigator, your own daughter no less, to drag a good woman's name through the mud. He gestured to the empty screen. You enabled this. You sat there and watched your son lie, and you were ready to cheer while he destroyed his wife. We didn't know, my father stammered. He told us. You didn't want to know. Holloway cut him off. Ignorance is not a defense when you are funding the prosecution. You wasted this court's time with false accusations. You wasted your daughter's time forcing her to uncover your son's moral bankruptcy. He turned his gaze to Kyle, who was slumped in his chair, deflated. Mr. Harvey, your petition to deny alimony is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, given the evidence of dissipation of marital assets, specifically spending family money on expensive dinners and jewelry for your mistress, I am ordering a forensic accounting of all your accounts. The judge picked up his pen. I am granting Mrs. Harvey the marital home. I am granting her full spousal support adjusted upward to account for the funds you misappropriated, and you will pay the legal fees for both parties, including the investigator's fee. He looked at me then. For a brief second, the stern mask slipped and he gave me a curt nod. It was the only approval I had received that day, and it was the only approval that mattered. This court finds the plaintiff's conduct reprehensible, Holloway concluded. Let this be a lesson. If you come to a court of equity, you must come with clean hands. Yours are filthy. Bang. The gavel came down. It sounded like a gunshot. It sounded like a door slamming shut on a lifetime of lies. It sounded like the final shutter click on a case that was finally truly closed. Court is adjourned, the bailiff announced. I stepped down from the stand. The room was buzzing with the chaotic energy of the aftermath, but I felt a strange, cold calm. I gathered my files. I didn't look at Kyle. I didn't need to. The image of him slumped in his chair, stripped of his arrogance, was already developed in my mind. The truth was out. The lens didn't lie, and for the first time in years, neither did I. The double doors of courtroom 4B swung shut behind me with a heavy pneumatic hiss, sealing the judgment inside. The hallway beyond was a canyon of polished marble and echoing footsteps, the kind of space designed to make you feel small and insignificant against the machinery of the state. It was cooler out here, the air conditioning humming a low mechanical drone that vibrated in the soles of my shoes. I walked a few paces and stopped near a frosted window leaning against the cold stone wall. My hands were steady, but there was a tremor deep in my chest, the aftershock of detonating a bomb you had been building for years. I didn't have to wait long for the shrapnel to fly. The doors burst open again, slamming against the stoppers with a violence that made a passing clerk jump. Kyle stormed out, his face a mask of twisted entitlement. He wasn't just angry. He was incredulous. For his entire life, the world had bent to his will, smoothed over by our parents' money and their desperate need for him to be perfect. Today, the world had snapped back, and he didn't know how to process the collision. He spotted me instantly. He marched across the corridor, his expensive shoes slapping loudly against the floor, closing the distance with the momentum of a man looking for a punching bag. You! He spat the word, dripping with venom. He stopped inches from me, invading my personal space, looming in a way that used to make me shrink back when we were kids. You think you're smart. You think this is funny. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked him in the eye, seeing the panic behind the rage. I think it's over, Kyle. I think the judge was pretty clear. You were supposed to be on my side, he shouted, his voice cracking. The echo carried down the long hallway, drawing glances from a few lawyers huddled near the elevators. He didn't care. Shame is a public emotion, and right now he was trying to outrun it by turning it into aggression. Mom and Dad paid you. They paid you to help me not to humiliate me in front of a judge. They paid me to find the truth. I said, my voice low and level, a stark contrast to his hysteria. I told you I don't work for you. I work for the facts. And the facts are that you're a liar who tried to frame his wife. You ruined my life. He raked a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting the facade. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost me? The alimony, the house, my reputation. I'm going to lose everything. You lost it the minute you bought that bracelet, I said. I just developed the pictures. The courtroom doors opened a third time, slower, now heavier. Robert and Ellen Harvey stepped out. They looked like they had aged 10 years in the last 20 minutes. My father was holding a manila envelope, the copies of the evidence I had submitted to the court. He held it gingerly as if the paper inside was radioactive. My mother was clutching his arm, her face pale, her eyes darting around the hallway as if looking for an exit from this reality. Kyle spun around to face them, his expression shifting instantly from aggression to victimhood. It was a transformation I had watched 1,000 times at the dinner table. He slumped his shoulders, opened his hands, and put on the face of the misunderstood prodigy. Dad, Kyle pleaded, stepping toward them. You have to fix this. You have to appeal. That judge, he's biased. And Reagan, she doctored those photos. You know she's always been jealous of me. She set me up. He waited. He waited for the familiar rhythm of our family dynamic to kick in. He waited for Dad to pull out his checkbook, for Mom to rush forward and smooth his lapel, for them to turn their united front against me and scold me for being difficult, for hurting my brother. But the rhythm was broken. The music had stopped. Robert Harvey didn't move. He stood rooted to the marble floor, looking at his son. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the projection of who he wanted Kyle to be. He was looking at the man standing in front of him. He looked down at the envelope in his hand, then back at Kyle. The cognitive dissonance that had sustained our family for 3 decades was shattering in real time. He saw the expensive suit paid for with debt. He saw the sweat on Kyle's upper lip. He saw the total lack of remorse, the narcissistic pivot to blame everyone else. Dad, Kyle asked, his voice wavering. The silence was stretching too long. Tell her she's fired. She did her job, Kyle, my father said. His voice was raspy, dry as dust. Kyle blinked, stunned. What? She did what we hired her to do, Robert repeated louder this time. He lifted the envelope. We hired her to find out who was cheating. We were so sure it was Sarah. We were ready to destroy that girl because you told us to. He took a ragged breath. But it wasn't Sarah. It was you. It was you the whole time. It's complicated, Kyle stammered, backing up a step. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Sarah, she's boring. She doesn't support me. I needed an outlet. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal, my mother whispered. She let go of my father's arm and stepped forward. Her voice was trembling. We sat in there and watched you lie to a judge. We watched you try to steal from the woman who washed your clothes and cooked your meals. We missed Reagan's graduation to bail you out of trouble, remember? We always thought you were the victim. We always thought you just had bad luck. She looked at him with a dawning horror. But you don't have bad luck, Kyle. You have bad character. The words hung in the air heavier than the humidity outside. Bad character. It was the ultimate judgment in a family that prided itself on appearances. Kyle looked from one parent to the other, realizing the bank of unconditional support had finally closed its doors. His face hardened. The mask slipped completely, revealing the petulant child beneath. Fine, he sneered, straightening his jacket. Be that way. Take her side. See if I care. I don't need you. I have other options. He turned on his heel, pulling out his phone. He was likely dialing the mistress, the woman with the diamonds and the expensive taste, unaware that without the family money, he was about to lose her too. He stormed down the hallway toward the exit, his footsteps fading into the distance, leaving a silence that felt deafening. I stayed by the wall, watching. I didn't gloat. There is no victory in watching a family implode, even if it's a controlled demolition you set in motion. Then the doors opened one last time. Sarah emerged. She looked different. She wasn't hunching anymore. She walked with the lightness of someone who has just set down a 100-pound pack. She saw my parents standing there looking like statues of grief, and she hesitated. She could have yelled at them. She could have screamed at them for the way they treated her, for the way they looked down on her for years. But she didn't. She simply nodded to them, a gesture of pity more than forgiveness, and then she turned to me. She walked over to where I was leaning against the wall. Up close, I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the weariness that hadn't quite lifted yet. But her eyes were clear. Reagan, she said softly. Sarah, I acknowledged. I didn't think anyone was watching, she said. At the shelter. I thought I was invisible. You're not invisible, I said. You were just in the wrong light. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her grip was strong, rough from the work she did. Thank you. You saved my life back there. You know that, right? He would have taken everything. I just took some pictures, I said, deflecting. I wasn't used to gratitude. In my line of work, people usually hated the messenger. No, she shook her head. You stood up. That's different. She released my hand and stepped back. I'm going to go. I have a shift at the center in an hour. Life goes on. Take the house, Sarah, I said. You earned it. She smiled, a small, genuine thing, and walked away down the corridor, heading toward the sunlight spilling through the glass doors at the far end. I was left alone with my parents. They hadn't moved. They were standing in the middle of the hallway, isolated. The space around them felt vast. Robert was staring at the floor. Ellen was weeping, silently pressing a tissue to her mouth. They looked lost. For 30 years, their entire identity had been wrapped up in protecting and promoting Kyle. They had sacrificed their retirement, their integrity, and their relationship with me to build a pedestal for him. Now the pedestal was smashed, and they were standing in the rubble. I pushed myself off the wall and walked over to them. I didn't stop to comfort them. I didn't offer a hug. I wasn't there yet. I walked past them, my heels clicking a steady rhythm. Reagan, my father called out. His voice was weak, stripped of its usual authority. I stopped and turned back. He looked at me, really. Looked at me, maybe for the first time since I was a child. He saw the PI license in my pocket. He saw the camera bag on my shoulder. He saw the daughter who had shown up, done the job, and told the truth. He started, but the words stuck in his throat. He looked at the empty space where Kyle had been then, at the empty space beside him, where I should have been all these years. The memory of the graduation auditorium seemed to float between us two empty chairs in row G. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. He realized that while they were busy staring at the empty chairs they reserved for Kyle, they had left mine empty too. I'll send you the final invoice, I said. I turned and walked away. The shutter in my mind clicked one last time, capturing them standing there, two small figures in a large gray hallway, finally crushed by the weight of the truth they had paid for. The silence they were left with was absolute. It was the sound of a house of cards hitting the floor. Winter came to St. Jude's Crossing 3 months later, burying the gray grime of the city under a foot of pristine white snow. It was the kind of snow that dampened sound, turning the usual roar of traffic into a muffled hush, as if the world was holding its breath waiting for a second chance. My office was warmer now thanks to a new radiator I'd installed, with the proceeds from a sudden influx of clients. The courtroom incident, as it was whispered about in legal circles, had been good for business. People realized that if Reagan Harvey could take down her own brother to serve the truth, she wouldn't hesitate to take down a cheating spouse or a corrupt partner. I wasn't the little sister anymore. I was the Iron Lady of 4th Street. But success is a cold companion on a Friday night. And as I sat there organizing files for a Monday surveillance job, the silence of the room felt less like peace and more like isolation. The knock on the door was different this time. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a desperate client or the confident rap of a process server. It was soft, almost apologetic. I walked to the frosted glass, wiped away a patch of condensation, and saw a silhouette I knew better than my own reflection. I opened the door. Robert Harvey stood there brushing snow off the shoulders of a wool coat that looked slightly too big for him now. He looked diminished, not in stature, but in ego. The bluster was gone. The certainty that he was the patriarch of a perfect dynasty had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, weary humility. He wasn't holding a checkbook this time. He was holding a Tupperware container. "Reagan," he said, his breath pluming in the cold air. I didn't know if you'd be here." "I'm always here, Dad," I said, leaning against the door frame. I didn't invite him in immediately. Boundaries are like fences. You have to maintain them, or people forget they exist. "What can I do for you?" He looked down at the container in his hands. "Your mother made lasagna. She made too much. We thought you might be hungry." He hesitated, then looked up, meeting my eyes with a difficulty that spoke volumes. "Actually, that's a lie. We didn't make too much. We made it for you. We were hoping you'd come over for dinner tonight." I studied him. This was the man who had demanded I fix his son's mess. Now he was standing in a drafty hallway, asking for my time. "Who's going to be there?" I asked. It was the only question that mattered. "Just us," he said quickly. "Just me and your mother." "And Kyle." "Kyle isn't invited," Robert said, firmly. The name didn't carry the usual reverence. It sounded like a heavy stone he had finally put down. "He's living in an apartment on the south side. He's working on himself. We cut him off, Reagan. The lawyer fees, the rent, the bailouts. It stopped. We told him he needs to grow up before he can come home." It was the first time in 28 years I had heard my father hold his son accountable. The shock of it almost made me smile. "Tough love. Overdue love," he corrected. "We failed him by protecting him. We know that now." He shifted his weight. "Please, it's been quiet at the house." "Too quiet." I looked at the snow falling behind him, filling the tracks he had made on the way up. I could have said no. I could have taken the lasagna, shut the door, and eaten it alone in my office while reviewing case files. It would have been safer. But the noir detective only stays lonely because they refuse to let the light in. I grabbed my coat. "Let me lock up." The drive to the house was silent, but it wasn't the tense silence of the courtroom. It was the silence of a reset button being pressed. When we pulled into the driveway of the childhood home, it looked different. Smaller, maybe. Or perhaps I had just grown too big for the shadows it used to cast over me. The windows were glowing with a warm yellow light, a beacon in the blue dark of the winter evening. Inside the house smelled of garlic basil and wood polish, the scent of a Sunday, even though it was Friday. My mother was setting the table. When she saw me, she froze, a napkin clutched in her hand. She looked terrified that I might turn around and leave. "Reagan," she breathed, "you came." Dad said there was lasagna. I said, keeping it light. We sat down. The table was set for 3. For years there had always been 4 settings, with the conversation revolving around the 4th chair. Kyle's job, Kyle's stress, Kyle's needs. Now that 4th spot was empty, but it didn't feel like a hole. It felt like space. Space for oxygen. Space for me. We ate in a tentative rhythm, the clinking of silverware filling the gaps where the lies used to be. We talked about the weather. We talked about the heating bill. And then, as the coffee was poured, my father put his cup down. We owe you an apology, he said. He didn't look at Mom for backup. He just looked at me. And not just for the court case. We apologized for that in the letter, but I know paper is cheap. He took a deep breath. I was looking at the photos you took, not the ones of Kyle, the ones of Sarah, the ones where she was helping people. And I realized we never looked at you. We never really saw what you were doing. We were so busy worrying about the squeaky wheel that we ignored the one that was carrying the load. My mother reached across the table. Her hand was shaking slightly. We missed your graduation, she said. The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. It was the trigger point, the wound that had never scabbed over. We left empty chairs there because Kyle called us with some drama that we should have let him handle. We chose his noise over your achievement. And we never made it right. I looked at the tablecloth tracing the pattern of the lace. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times. In my imagination, I would scream at them. I would list every grievance, every missed birthday, every tuition check they didn't write. But now that it was here, the anger wasn't there. The courtroom incident had burned the anger out of me. What was left was just clarity. You hurt me, I said. I didn't shout. I stated it as a fact, like reading an evidence log. You taught me that I had to be perfect to be noticed. And even then, it wasn't enough. You taught me that truth mattered less than appearance. We know, my father whispered. We were wrong. We are so sorry, Reagan. We are trying to learn. It's hard for old dogs, but we are trying. Kyle is cut off, I verified. Completely, Mom said. He asked for money for a new car last week. We told him to take the bus. He hung up on us. It hurts, but the judge was right. We were crippling him. I took a sip of coffee. It was hot, strong, and sweet. I'm not going to come over every Sunday, I said. I have a business to run. I have a life. And I'm not going to be the replacement golden child just because Kyle is out of the picture. We don't want a golden child, Robert said. We just want our daughter. Okay, I said. Then we start with dinner, once a month. And if you ever try to hire me to stalk a family member again, my rate doubles. It was a joke, dry and dark, but my father laughed. It was a rusty sound, unused for years, but it was genuine. My mother smiled, and the tension in her shoulders finally broke. We sat there for another hour. For the first time, they asked me about my work. They didn't ask if it was dangerous. They asked how I solved the Peterson case. They asked about the lens I used. They listened. They didn't interrupt to compare me to Kyle. They just listened to the person I had become, despite them. When I finally stood to leave, the snow had stopped. The night was clear, the stars hard and bright above the suburban rooftops. My parents walked me to the door. There were no grand hugs, no tearful embraces. We weren't that kind of family, and we never would be. But there was a handshake from my father that was firm and respectful, and a light touch on the arm from my mother that felt like an olive branch. Drive safe, my father said. The roads are slick. I know how to handle a skid, I said. I walked to my car, the cold air biting my cheeks. I looked back at the house once. The light in the window was still on, but the shadow of the past didn't reach me out here in the driveway. I got into my car and turned the key. The engine hummed to life, a steady, reliable sound. As I pulled out onto the street, I thought about the case. I thought about Sarah safe in her home. I thought about Kyle finally facing the consequences of his own reflection. And I thought about the empty chairs at graduation. They were still empty in my memory, and they always would be. You can't change the evidence of the past. But as I drove toward the city, toward my office and my future, I realized I didn't need to stare at them anymore. I had developed the film. I had closed the file. The rain had stopped. The snow had covered the scars on the pavement. For the first time in years, the view through the windshield was clear. I turned up the radio, letting the static fade into a song, and drove into the night, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman who had found the truth. And the truth was, I was enough. And that brings us to the end of Reagan's journey for truth. Sometimes, the hardest evidence to face is the kind found within our own families. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that subscribe button. What would you have done in Reagan's position? Let us know below because we read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.